Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's look at the top stories this hour. Local hospitals say Israeli strikes and gunfire killed at least 33 Palestinians in Gaza as a UN-backed body confirmed famine in Gaza City. Israeli Defense Minister warned the city could be destroyed in a new operation. Israel also dismisses the famine report as a lie. A Ukrainian drone attack sparked a fire and damaged an auxiliary transformer at Russia's Kursk nuclear power plant, forcing a capacity reduction in one reactor, officials have said from the region. Russia claims the UAV was shot down by air defences near the facility, with the fire quickly extinguished and no radiation leak reported. Former Defence Minister Benny Gantz has called on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to form a unity government with opposition members to secure the release of hostages in Gaza. The move would sideline far-right coalition partners who oppose any deal with Hamas, even as Israel threatens to destroy Gaza City if hostages are not freed. After Trump's deployment of troops in the US Capitol, hundreds of National Guard were posted on the National Mall, posing for selfies and mingling with tourists, despite it being one of the safest parts of Washington. City leaders call it merely a show of force by President Trump. The Pentagon is preparing options to deploy US troops to Chicago as well, as President Trump vows a crackdown on crime, homelessness and illegal immigration, the Washington Post has said. Officials say the plans in the works for weeks include sending several thousand National Guard members as early as September. Taiwan is accusing Beijing of falsifying history by claiming communist forces led the fight against Japan in World War II as tensions rise against China's planned military parade. Veterans in Taipei, marking the war's 80th anniversary, say the nationalist government did most of the fighting, while Taiwan urges its citizens to boycott China's parade. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un oversaw tests of two new air defense missiles, which state media claimed had superior combat ability against targets like drones and cruise missiles. The launch came hours after South Korea fired warning shots at North Korean troops who briefly crossed the demilitarized zone amid joint US-South Korea military drills and a planned Trump-Lee summit in Washington. Syria's Electoral Commission says the country's first parliamentary vote under its new Islamist government will not be held in Sawida and two other provinces due to security concerns. The move follows deadly July clashes in Sawida, where hundreds were killed in fighting between Druze forces, Sunni Bedouin tribes and government troops. We start this hour in West Asia, where Israeli strikes and gunfire have killed at least 33 Palestinians in Gaza on Saturday, including people sheltering in tents and those lining up for food. This comes as the United Nations formally declared a famine in Gaza City, blaming Israel's obstruction of aid during more than 22 months of war. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected the findings as an outright lie, while Defense Minister Israel Katz has warned that Gaza City could be destroyed in a new military operation. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Initiative, otherwise known as the IPC, an international monitoring group, estimates that 500,000 people in Gaza are already experiencing famine, with conditions expected to spread further south by the end of September. Residents of Gaza City say they are living in fear and deep despair, with no safe haven as Israel's bombardment intensifies. Many have lost homes, income and family members and say it now feels like the end is near. Let's listen to what a few residents of the enclave had to say.
طلعنا من تحت القذائف والنار كل يوم بخبط علينا قذائف في الحاره الثانيه وطلعنا تاع الصبحيه على الشغل بأمان الله. فيش ساعتين زمن على 10 ونص رنوا على المربع كله، يخلي المربع كله يضربوا ضرب بصل وضرب عوجل. هاي اللي
أمريكا، مصر، كل الدول العربية وين هم؟ يجوا يشوفونا على أرض الواقع، يجوا على أرض على الزيتون يشوفوا إيش بيصير فينا. اتدمرنا، انخرب ديارنا، من وين بدنا نعيش؟ من وين بدنا ناكل؟ يلا مدبرين حالنا في الأكل، كمان الدور تاعتنا تروح. إيش ننام في الشارع زي الدواب يا عمي؟ ارحمونا يا عالم، ارحمونا.
Now over to the diplomatic front, where hundreds of Israelis, including... Now over to a related development, where hundreds of Israelis, including hostage families and activists, rallied outside the military headquarters in Tel Aviv on Saturday night, demanding a comprehensive deal with Hamas to secure the release of all hostages in Gaza. The crowd, carrying drums, posters and slogans against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, called for an end to the war and urged leaders to act before it is too late. Here's what a protester had to say.
We are here to protest against the Israeli government and specifically about Benjamin Netanyahu sabotaging again and again a deal of releasing the hostages and bringing them back home. We want all the hostages back home. The ones that are dead to be buried as proper, and the ones that are alive back to rehabilitation. We want them home, and we want them home now.
The protest came as Netanyahu announced Israel would begin negotiations to free hostages while preparing a new military push into Gaza City. Meanwhile, his rival, Blue and White Party leader Benny Gantz proposed forming a temporary unity government focused on rescuing hostages and passing an ultra-Orthodox draft law, with elections to follow in 2026. Here's what he had to say.
אני קורא לנתניהו, ליאיר לפיד ולאביגדור ליברמן. הגיעה העת לממשלת פדיון שבויים, תומכת משרתים וקצובה בזמן. במשך חצי שנה נשלים את שתי המשימות האלו ונצא לבחירות. העקרונות יהיו שכהונת הממשלה תחל בעסקת חטופים שתשיב את כולם הביתה.
According to Israeli officials, about 50 hostages remain in Gaza, 20 of which are believed to be still alive. A ceasefire proposal on the table includes a 60-day truce, the release of 10 living hostages and 18 bodies in exchange for around 200 Palestinian prisoners. Listen in to what the families of the hostages still in the Gaza Strip had to say amid the protests.
687 days that our loved ones, 50 hostages, are still being held in the hell that is Gaza. We call upon the people of Israel. Netanyahu can sign a deal today that will bring home 10 living hostages and 18 fallen hostages. If Netanyahu signs a deal, he can begin negotiations the very next day to secure the return of all remaining hostages in exchange for ending the war. Netanyahu can bring home the hostages who are enduring Holocaust-like conditions. But instead of accepting the deal, he is racing toward the conquest of Gaza. He repeatedly places obstacles in the way of an agreement and then blames Hamas. But anyone who truly wants to bring the hostages home does not launch a ground invasion of Gaza. Anyone who truly wants a comprehensive deal does not set impossible conditions.
And so we turn to the President of the United States, Donald Trump. Mr. President, sir, we are reaching out to you because we know that you are a president of life and peace, not of death and wars. Lives can be saved. Our loved ones can be brought out of the tunnels alive. Only you can instruct Netanyahu to end the war and bring an end to the loss of life. The opportunity is now. If Netanyahu launches an operation, it will bring only death and our loved ones will die. Right now, they are alive, surviving in the tunnels. Mr. President, seal the deal.
In a separate development, Turkish First Lady Emin Erdogan wrote to First Lady Melania Trump urging her to speak out for the children of Gaza. She called on Netanyahu to show mercy, citing more than 18,000 children killed during the war, and compared the suffering in Gaza to Nazi camps. We're now joined by our guest, Rohan Gunaratne, who's an international affairs expert, and he joins us live from Singapore to discuss the ongoing crisis in the Gaza Strip. Thank you very much, Professor Gunaratne, for joining us here on the programme. Let's first start in the enclave, where there has been this damning UN report that says that Israeli obstruction is causing a famine in the Gaza Strip. Israel has said that these claims are lies. Israel insists it is not blocking aid. How do you assess the competing narratives between UN agencies and the Israeli government, Professor Gunaratne?
Thomas, the real issue is that the Hamas is disrupting the flow of aids by taking over the food, and they are controlling the food. Everyone knows that there are sufficient images of it. And this famine story is being used to stop Israeli operations from continuing in Gaza. What is pragmatic is for Israel to agree to a deal or a negotiation, a hostage deal, where the 10 living hostages, they are released, and the 18 fallen hostages, that is their bodies are returned, because in the Jewish tradition, this is so important to recover the bodies. Because if Israel does a conquest of Gaza at this point, none of the hostages are likely to be released in military operations. So I believe that at this time, there is a shift towards a negotiated settlement. But there should be a second phase where Hamas disarms and Hamas surrenders. As long as Hamas, that staged a brutal terrorist attack that led to this devastating war, still survives, there will be no peace in the Middle East. So the hostage release should be followed by another phase of activity where Hamas disarms and surrenders.
Professor Gunaratne, obviously Israel has called this a lie. What motivation does the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Initiative, or the IPC, have in lying about there being a famine in Gaza? This has nothing to do with UNRWA, the separate UN body which Israel claims has affiliation with Hamas, had affiliation with October the 7th. Why is Israel calling this a lie, and what evidence does it have that this is a lie? We've all seen the images of starving children throughout mainstream media and social media. What is the reason and motivation that this UN-backed body has for calling this a famine?
The UAE, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and a number of other countries have been airdropping aid. They have also sent tons of supplies of food through the land route. Looking at the amount of food that has been sent to Gaza and the population in Gaza, there cannot be famine. The international community has not abandoned Gaza. What is important is that Hamas should take the responsibility for the war. Hamas should take responsibility for disrupting food supplies, and Hamas should take the responsibility for the hostage taking. And if both these issues are not addressed, one is the humanitarian assistance, it should continue to Gaza, because civilians should not suffer because of a brutal terrorist attack. But it is also important for that phase of activity of feeding the people, sustaining the people of Gaza is followed with the release of the hostages, because security situation is also important, maintaining security and stability for the Israelis. So there should be, the Palestinians should be saved from a famine. certainly the Israeli security also should be guaranteed. And that's why both these initiatives in parallel should work. But I have not seen evidence of famine in Gaza. Many of the images that have been published have been fake images or images of children who are dying or ill for other medical reasons. There is no real famine in Gaza. Of course, a famine can happen if the international agencies are not going to continue to supply the Palestinian population in the next phase, because IDF is planning the conquest of Gaza. They have already moved sufficient troops, and there will be another phase of war unless those 10 hostages are released and unless the 18 fallen hostages, their bodies are not returned.
Thank you, Professor Rohan Gunaratne, for joining us here on NewsX World. Pleasure to have you on, as always. We now move over to Europe, where a Ukrainian drone strike triggered a fire and forced a reduction in output at Russia's Kursk nuclear power plant. The plant's press service said an auxiliary transformer was damaged, cutting capacity at one of the reaction units by half. Russian air defences intercepted the drone near the facility, but the detonation sparked the fire, which has now been extinguished. Officials reported no casualties and said radiation levels remain within normal limits. Meanwhile, on Saturday, Moscow announced that its troops had captured 2 villages, Serdnai and Klebanitsk, in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk region. The advances bring Russian forces closer to Konstantin, a heavily fortified town and logistical hub on the road to Kramatorsk. Following this, Ukraine says its troops are holding the line and even recaptured a village elsewhere in Donetsk, highlighting the heavy back-and-forth fighting. These parallel developments, a drone strike inside Russia and Russian gains on the front, underscore the war's escalating intensity in its 4th year, even as diplomatic efforts to broker a summit between Putin and Zelensky appear to stall. Okay, we are obviously covering the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. Slight Russian gains we hear about in the eastern front of Ukraine, where most of the fighting is continuing. Moscow has announced that it has captured 2 new villages, Shredny and Klebanitsk. These are in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk region, which has been a hot spot for conflict and a region and an area of Ukraine that Russia wants to obtain. Obviously, Ukraine's sovereignty, Ukraine sees that as part of its sovereignty. And as these peace negotiations and diplomatic efforts continue, it will be very interesting to see how territory is negotiated, especially as Russia continues to advance on Ukrainian soil. There's also been a drone strike which has triggered a fire on a Russian nuclear power plant, which has started a fire on an auxiliary transformer which has been damaged, which has cut the capacity by half at one of the reactor units. And this is obviously has the backdrop of ongoing diplomacy as efforts continue with Donald Trump trying to broker a peace deal between Vladimir Zelensky and Vladimir Putin. Okay, we are joined now by Ross Feingold. He is a political analyst and he joins us from Taipei, Taiwan. Ross, thank you as always for joining us here on the program. Ross, we have news of further advancements of Russian forces into Ukrainian territory. 2 more villages being captured in the eastern Donetsk region. Military capabilities by Moscow seem to be advancing Ukraine's. How are these going to affect diplomatic talks going forward? And going into talks, how are both sides feasing in their military positions?
Although the gains made by Russia's military on the ground in eastern Ukraine are very incremental, but in response to your, in response to your question, it might very well harden President Trump's position from the perspective that President Trump is going to put pressure on Ukraine and President Zelensky to accept some kind of ceasefire arrangement that requires acknowledgement that the Russian military is going to continue to occupy part of Ukrainian territory. Certainly, it looks unrealistic to expect Russia to withdraw. So again, President Trump is going to look at these kinds of gains, and specifically when it involves actual villages or towns, something that President Trump could point to rather than just open ground. For example, President Trump is going to say to Zelensky that you're losing towns, you're losing villages. You have no choice but to reach a ceasefire agreement based on what territory Russia continues to occupy. And then from Russia's perspective, that just gives them even more incentive during this period when the United States is putting pressure on both sides to reach an agreement. It really gives Russia an incentive to continue its attempts to move forward, however incremental those gains might be.
Ross, thank you very much for that insight. We're also joined by Professor Veselin Popovsky. He is a professor and vice dean at Jindal Global Law School, and he joins us live from New Delhi. Thank you very much, Professor Popovsky, for joining us here on the program. We just ran through a couple of military updates that have occurred. Moscow has announced that it has captured 2 new villages in the Donetsk region. If you could go over the importance, the territorial importance of this region, and also the fight, the long fight over the Donetsk and its territorial importance for us.
Yes. Well, I wouldn't worry too much about 2 villages being captured by the Russian army. You know, they like to report to Putin good news every day when he wakes up. And if they lose those 2 settlements tomorrow, they will not report that. I will take the longer perspective. How much territory has the Russian army captured over the last 12 months? And it's nothing significant. It's 3,000 square kilometers, but the battlefield line is 1,000 kilometers. So effectively, Russia advanced 3 kilometers for 1 year, which is nothing. Well, somewhere they may advance 10 kilometers, somewhere they lost a couple of kilometers, but that's the kind of indication that we really have a stalemate with very small advances somewhere, often. And, you know, last week they also reported Dobropilia, a kind of a bigger village, and they lost it after that. So really nothing significant in terms of Russian advances. And I kind of don't share the opinion of a previous speaker. It doesn't change much also in terms of Donald Trump's strategy. In fact, I see everything in Alaska that has been discussed is no longer there. There is no longer discussion about territorial swaps. It was not, by the way, Ukraine that doesn't want ceasefire. Repeatedly over the last 6 months, Vladimir Zelensky was the one who wanted to have a ceasefire, even limited to 30 days. It was Vladimir Putin who denied every attempt for a ceasefire, continued attacks on civilian targets over those 6 months, and also rejected a high-level meeting with Zelensky. So the non-cooperative party in all of those 6 months has been the Russian Federation, not the Ukrainians. Ukrainians accepted the Donald Trump proposal for temporary ceasefire many times. They accepted the high-level meeting with Putin many times, and it is only the Russian Federation reluctance to see any progress here that actually leave us back where we are always.
Professor Popovsky, do stay with us as we discuss further updates. In Armenia, about 100 protesters rallied outside a Russian base in Gulmi on Saturday, demanding Moscow to withdraw its troops, which is now seen as a sign of strained ties since 2023 Nagorno-Karabakh war. Let's listen in to what some of the protesters had to say.
20 թվականի պատերազմում մատը մատին չի խփել եւ իր դաշնակցային պարտավորությունները հայ ժողովրդի նկատմամբ Հայաստանի նկատմամբ չի իրականացրել ավելին 2010 թվականից 10 միլիարդ դոլար հարձակողական սպառազինություն է վաճառել Ադրբեջանին շատ լավ իմանալով որ այդ զենքը կրակելու է Հայաստանի իր դաշնակից Հայաստանի վրա Ռուսաստանի այս ռազմական ներկայությունը խորհրդանշում է այն ֆաշիստական պատերազմը, այն եղերական պատերազմը, որ Ռուսաստանը վարում է Ուկրաինայի դեմ, եւ այդ պատերազմի իրողությունը մեզ համար վերահաստատում է, որ մենք այս ռազմաբազան կրկնակի այստեղ հեռացնելու պատճառ ունենք։
Ես մտածում եմ, որ ռուսական ռազմաբազան, ինչպես նաև ռուսական ազդեցությունը պետք է չեզոքանա դուրս գա Հայաստանից, քանի որ մեր 200-ամյա պատմությունը ցույց տվեց, որ Ռուսաստանը այստեղ է ոչ թե մեզ փրկելու, մեզ օգնելու համար, այլ ցույց է տվել պատմությունը, որ իրենք միայն մեզ վնասում են։
Meanwhile, in Europe, a diplomatic clash has escalated between France and Italy. Italy's Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini mocked French President Emmanuel Macron's call for deploying European troops in Ukraine in a post-war settlement. Let's listen in to what he said on the issue.
Penso che Trump, con i suoi modi che a volte possono sembrare bruschi o irrituali, stia riuscendo laddove hanno fallito tutti gli altri, quindi rimettere a un tavolo Putin e Zelensky, qualcosa che non accadeva da anni. Poi starà a loro scegliere qual è il punto d'incontro, però sicuramente eserciti europei, riarmi europei, debiti comuni europei per comprare missili o macronate varie, non disturbiamo quelli che stanno lavorando per la pace. I guerrafondai e i bombaroli tacciano, almeno nel mese di agosto tacciano. I nostri figli non andranno a combattere in Ucraina.
Following this, Paris summoned Italy's ambassador, warning the remarks undermined trust between the two countries. The incident adds to a history of friction over migration, European policy and security since Giorgia Meloni's government took office. Furthermore, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa continues his push for new talks, speaking with Volodymyr Zelensky and other leaders this week to press for bilateral and trilateral meetings involving Russia, Ukraine and the United States. In another development in Washington, the Wall Street Journal reports the Pentagon has quietly blocked Ukraine from using long-range US missiles against targets inside Russia, restricting Kiev's options. We're now once again joined by Professor Veselin Popovsky to discuss further updates from the Ukraine war. Thank you very much, Professor Popovsky, once again for joining us. Let's first talk about this spat between the Italian and French diplomats. Italy's coalition cabinet and Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini has mocked French President Emmanuel Macron's call for deploying European troops in Ukraine in a post-war settlement. Your thoughts on this? Giorgia Meloni, of course, is a member of the coalition of the willing. She was present at that Washington meeting with Zelensky. What are your thoughts on the Italian Deputy Prime Minister's comments there?
Yes, Matteo Salvini, we know who he is. It's kind of an extreme nationalist, nothing surprising, and also not significant at all because Prime Minister Meloni is definitely on the right side of the debate here. I don't see this as anything significant. It will be forgotten tomorrow. In fact, the French position is very clear. It aligns with the British position, with the Polish, the Baltic states. There should be troops on the ground in Ukraine. And what Matteo Salvini is simply trying to say that this may not be acceptable. He's basically voicing the rejection of the Russian foreign minister, also Lavrov, that they will never allow any NATO troops on the Ukrainian territory. It's not for Russia to decide that. The Europeans have their security concerns, and they can deploy troops to Ukraine without asking Russians. So definitely this is not anything, doesn't change anything. You mentioned correctly, Thomas, that the Italian coalition is a little bit fragile, exactly because to have the majority in the Italian parliament, they have to also rely on the votes of this extreme nationalist, and he's also deputy prime minister. It's a fragile coalition, but I don't expect much of a trouble in the future on this point.
Professor Veselin Popovsky, thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. Pleasure to have you as always. We now move over to the United States, where hundreds of National Guard soldiers in military were seen in and near Washington's National Mall, one of the safest areas in the capital. The soldiers are in Washington to assist with a federal crackdown on what President Donald Trump describes as a crime epidemic. However, this claim seems contradicted by the fact that the crime rates have decreased overall in recent years. Meanwhile, the U.S. Defense Headquarters, the Pentagon, is also planning to deploy the military in the Democratic-run Chicago as President Donald Trump pushes for a crackdown on crime, homelessness, and undocumented immigration. Trump said that Chicago is a mess, criticizing the city's mayor as he persisted in his attacks on cities governed by Democratic politicians. Under Washington's Home Rule Act, the president can take control of DC's Metropolitan Police for up to 30 days during an emergency, with an extension requiring approval from both Senate and the House. A bill introduced by RE Republican Andy Biggs seeks to extend this takeover to 6 months and amend the act to apply to all future declared emergencies. We are once again joined by Ross Feingold to discuss this further. Ross, Donald Trump has come under huge scrutiny for this. We saw his actions in Los Angeles, where he even got the Marines involved in those protests after he had ICE officers come in. And now we're sort of seeing a repeat of this in Washington. However, it hasn't been to the same extent, and a possible stint for National Guards in Chicago, a city where the crime rate is very high. However, it is another Democrat-run city. Are criticisms of Donald Trump using his powers against cities that politically lean against him, are they correct?
Whether or not it's correct, if he wants to do it, he's going to do it. So there's little to stop him from calling out National Guard and using them in this kind of law enforcement role, even though there's political opposition from Democrats. People will try to sue in courts. But ultimately, it seems that the strategy at the moment is to do this for brief periods of time, such as a month. The base, the Republican Party base, they generally support it. And when the people who oppose it complain, by the time they've complained loud enough or they try to go into court, the deployment is over. So I would expect President Trump and his team to look consider very carefully the possibility of doing this in other cities, because they've learned from their experience in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., that they can do it, and they could claim that they made more arrests or that crime fell during the time while the deployment was on. So I think President Trump and his team, they actually only see upside in doing this.
Ross Feingold, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but thank you very much for joining us. Pleasure as always. Well, that is all that we have time for, but we will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world. Thank you very much for joining us.